All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA speaker session entitled "What Antifa Is, What It Isn't, and Why It Matters." I'd also like to briefly thank today's speakers, Dr. Michael Kenney and Dr. Colin Clarke, for taking the time to present today. So a few quick housekeeping items before we begin. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the brief. During the brief or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions through the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has two overlapping speech bubbles, one containing a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before your question, or if you prefer for your name to not be recorded, you can go ahead and submit your questions anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. So now I'm going to briefly turn the floor over to SMA's director, Mr. Todd Veazey, to give a few remarks. So Todd, over to you.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks everyone for dialing in today. I felt because of the topic and all of the sort of division in our country and the things surrounding these sort of extremist political movements and organizations, I wanted to just share again SMA's first principles as a way to kind of set the table and ground us again. And our speaker series is what we really consider each and every day as we develop it as a marketplace for ideas. It's a chance to bring on scholars, thought leaders from all over the world to share ideas and hopefully expand your strategic horizons, those of our community who are either practitioners charged with actually making a difference in terms of our national security and prosperity of our country and our allies. But also the researchers who devote their time to studying national security issues, and journalists and everyone else that's part of our community who all sort of focuses on this and all has the higher cause of advancing our national security. Many of the topics we choose come straight from the headlines. And others are probably underserved, and we're proud to shine a light on those and lift those up equally because oftentimes they are those important gray rhinos that we should be considering more fulsomely. But for those things that are in the headlines, there often is a political edge to them. We in SMA don't care about that. We are apolitical. We work very hard to stay dispassionate in our day-to-day work, but also in our speaker series. Our thought is really to try to get at the dynamics of the challenges that present concerns for our national security community and the underlying dynamics that give rise to these phenomenology. We try to make this evidence based. It's not a bunch of people with opinions generally. It's really trying to get at the essence of these things so that the people charged with doing something about it can do so in a more informed way, can think about these problems differently because of the hour we might have spent together discussing it. A couple months ago, we hosted Dr. Mia Bloom, who talked about her research on the very important topic of QAnon. And I had a lot of comments that were, hey, what about BLM? What about Antifa? And we're not in the business of moral equivalencies or looking for sort of the political, what about them, what about these guys? We look at each distinctly, and the purpose of our talk today is to talk about Antifa, what it is, what it isn't, and why that matters. What might we do about it from that understanding? And the same was true for Mia's talk on QAnon. So with that and with that spirit, I would love to have Colin and Michael join us and kick it off. We're going to go back to Nicole for the introductions, but I at least wanted to set the table a little bit and get back to first principles. So thank you all for your participation, and hopefully we'll learn a lot more and be a lot smarter about Antifa today. Thank you.
All right, thank you again, Todd. So as Todd just mentioned, I will briefly introduce today's speakers before I turn the floor over to them. Dr. Colin Clarke is a Senior Research Fellow with the Soufan Center and the Director of Policy and Research at the Soufan Group, where his research focuses on domestic and transnational terrorism, international security, and geopolitics. He's also an Associate Fellow at the International Center for Counterterrorism at The Hague. Dr. Michael Kenney has published numerous academic journals on terrorism, Islamist militancy, and global crime, and he now serves on the editorial board of Terrorism and Political Violence. He's supported by the National Science Foundation, the Office for Naval Research, and the National Institute of Justice, and has conducted field research around the world in places like Brazil, Colombia, Israel, Morocco, and Spain. So Dr. Clarke, I'm going to turn the floor over to you first.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to Todd and Nicole, Mariah, everybody for their support, and for everybody joining this talk today at DoD, at the Joint Chiefs, and wherever you're dialing in from. What we're going to do is the laydown of the talk. I'm first going to begin by putting the violence in perspective. Where do we think violence from the far left sits more broadly? Dr. Kenney is going to talk about the ideology and the organizational structure of Antifa, and then I'm going to wrap up with what I call dispelling myths and discussing disinformation. So pretty straightforward, and then we look forward to a robust Q&A. So putting the violence in perspective, I'm going to talk a little bit about data, and this is data from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They put out a number of reports this past year on domestic terrorism. I had the pleasure of serving as the reviewer, one of the reviewers for this report. So I actually got to go into the database and look at how they collected and analyzed the data. And CSI has found that over the course of 2020, at least up until data collected up until late August, anarchists, anti-fascists, and other like-minded extremists orchestrated 20% of the plots and the attacks. Though the number of incidents grew from previous years, and these extremists targeted law enforcement, military, and government facilities and personnel. I don't think you can talk about the far left without talking about the far right. Antifa, anti-fascist, views themselves in opposition to a growing far right movement. So just to situate, the data, 20% of the plots and attacks attributed to anarchists, anti-fascists, and other like-minded extremists. White supremacists and other like-minded extremists on the far right conducted 2/3 of the plots and attacks, so roughly 66%. So that gives you a sense, and again, this isn't my opinion, this is looking at the data. If you want to take a broader kind of view, let's look at data collected between January 1994 and May 2020. In total, 893 terrorist incidents in the United States. Of that, Antifa made up a tiny percentage of overall terrorist attacks and casualties. Right-wing terrorists, 57% during that time period. 15% from religious terrorists, although, as we know, September 11, 2001, responsible for 2,977 deaths. So, a pretty big swath of fatalities. In comparison, right-wing terrorist attacks caused 335 fatalities in that same time period. Left-wing attacks, 22, if that gives you a sense of kind of proportionality there. Viewed in this context, the threat from Antifa-associated actors in the U.S. is relatively small. What do we consider far-left terrorism, right? And Michael will talk a little bit more about the ideology and the definitions there, but for the purposes of the CSIS report, they define far-left terrorism as the use or threat of violence by subnational or non-state entities that oppose the following: capitalism, imperialism, and colonialism, that advocate Black nationalism, that pursue environmental or animal rights issues, that espouse pro-communist or pro-socialist beliefs, or that support a decentralized social and political system such as anarchism. Militant anti-fascism would fit under this far left umbrella, defined broadly. And I think there's two major incidents to talk about. The first is in July 2019. An individual named Willem van Spronsen attacked an Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention center in Tacoma, Washington. He had a rifle and incendiary devices. He was a 68-year-old man. He was shot and killed by the police. And after his death, there was a manifesto posted in his name on It's Going Down and other anarchist websites. Within the manifesto, Van Spronsen identifies himself as an Antifa supporter. He says, and I quote, "I am Antifa." He rails against the Trump administration's policy of detaining illegal immigrants. And I quote, fascist hooligans preying on vulnerable people in our streets. And he calls for violent resistance against the government. And I quote, I strongly encourage comrades and incoming comrades to arm themselves. We are now responsible for defending people from the predatory state. August 2020, you have another incident. Michael Reinhold, another self-identified Antifa member, shoots and kills Aaron J. Danielson, who's an individual associated with Patriot Prayer, a right-wing group at a rally in Portland, Oregon. So those are your kind of two headline attacks of Antifa. And I want to kind of turn it over now to Michael, who will tell you exactly what Antifa believes, what they stand for, and what do we make of this movement? Is it a network, organization, structure, et cetera? So Michael, please, over to you.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you to SMA for the opportunity, and thank you to the audience. So since 2017, I've been conducting research on anti-fascism and anarchism in the US. I've done field work in a couple of different cities, and I've interviewed a small sample of core activists who self-identify as anti-fascists and/or anarchists. So what I'm going to speak to, organizational structure and ideology, comes directly from that research, the interviews, as well as the secondary source research that I did as well, okay? Excuse me. Contrary to how it is sometimes portrayed in the media, Antifa, which is short for anti-fascist, is not a single monolithic organization. Rather, it is a loose network of what they call affinity groups, local groups of activists who coordinate in different areas. And within that, or I should say, building outside of the local affinity groups, is a broader movement of groups and individuals who support anti-fascist ideals in different areas, both within the US and outside the US. So there is a transnational phenomenon associated with anti-fascism. There's a strong presence in Western Europe. What I'm going to be speaking to, however, is in the US. So Antifa is essentially what social movement scholars refer to as a counter movement. They're dedicated, in this case, to countering or stopping what they call far-right extremists and racists, who they broadly label as fascists. They seek to stop these individuals and groups from organizing, from engaging in activism, and from propagating their views in public. Antifa has no centralized leadership structure or even formalized membership. In the US, some anti-fascist groups do share ideas and participate in something called the Torch Network, which is a loose network that's composed of different principles of action. But neither the Torch Network nor the popular websites that Colin mentioned, It's Going Down, Crime Think, and others, exert any sort of command and control over local activists. There is no national leadership, and not all anti-fascist groups even affiliate with the Torch Network. So the basic organizational vehicle of anti-fascist activism in the United States is the affinity group. I want to quote from an anti-fascist document. This comes from the Crime Think website. It's called Recipes for Disaster, an Anarchist Cookbook. This document defines an affinity group, and I quote, as a circle of friends who, knowing each other's strengths, weaknesses, and backgrounds, have already established a common language and healthy internal dynamics, set out to accomplish a goal or series of goals. An affinity group is not a permanent arrangement, but a structure of convenience, ever mutable, assembled from the pool of interested and trusted people for the duration of a specific project. So I've interviewed people that belong to affinity groups, and I've asked them about their structure, and it's very similar to that definition. It's groups of trusted friends in local areas. They don't necessarily all live in the same area, however. Some affinity groups that members will live in different parts of the country, and then they come together to participate in a specific protest. Internal decision-making is based on group consensus and direct democracy. And they communicate both face-to-face through social media and also over encrypted apps. So how big is Antifa? Well, first thing regarding membership, people do not become card-carrying members of Antifa, okay? There's no loyalty oath or pledge or formal induction process. People become anti-fascist to the extent that they self-identify with the movement, support the cause, and become willing to engage in activism on its behalf. Some cities have local groups that self-identify as Antifa. So prominent examples, Rose City Antifa in Portland, Oregon, New York City Antifa or NYC Antifa in New York, Philly Antifa, Berkeley Antifa, Atlanta Antifa. There are dozens of examples. These groups engage in both digital activism and offline direct actions. They also are they practice robust operational security, and they don't publicize their numbers or their participants' identities, which obviously makes it harder to figure out how many there are. Okay. Nationally, as far as I can tell from my research, the movement appears to be fairly small and dispersed. I would estimate that there could be several thousand dedicated anti-fascists within the United States. But that's obviously a very kind of broad and vague number. Could be 3,000, could be 5,000. It could be more. Now, not all of those people engage in direct action or violence, right? Some of them stick to community organizing. Some of them stick to the digital activism, such as doxing people they identify as white supremacists. Either way, it's a fairly small movement. And I think we should be skeptical about Antifa's ability to direct large nationwide protest movement. Obviously, I'm thinking of the BLM protests over the past summer, right? Anti-fascists did participate in those protests. They provided security, they served as street medics, but they were not directing the protests. They're actually very deferential towards Black BLM activists. In terms of the ideology, just very quick, Antifa is short for anti-fascism. The core belief is essentially this: their supporters seek to expose, confront, and stop what they call far-right extremism, racism, and fascism. They want to stop these people from organizing and propagating their views in public. They do apply the fascist label loosely, very loosely, I would say. Anybody on the far right, they call a fascist. Trump supporters, they often call fascists. They're not very good at splitting hairs there. They do tend to lump people together. That's true. Beyond their commitment to anti-fascism, Antifa supporters do not follow a single ideology. It is true that many anti-fascists express political beliefs commonly associated with the far left. Anti-fascism has always been an explicitly leftist position, according to Stanislav Vysotsky, who recently published a book on the subject. Okay, so the main political ideology associated with American anti-fascism, I would say, is far left libertarian and anarchist beliefs. Okay, you also have people that identify as anti-fascists who on the economic side of things are more communist and socialist. And then you have people that kind of mix and match ideas. Some of the respondents in my sample self-identify as anarcho-communists, which they mean is a mix of anarchism and communism. And then you have people, as Colin said, they're anti-capitalists, they're environmentalists, they're LGBTQ, they support indigenous rights. So it really is a diverse collection of different people with different ideas. Historically, however, anti-fascism has been associated with the larger anarchist movement. This is true both in Western Europe and the United States. I think that I'm happy to talk more about Antifa's contentious politics and the specific tactics they use, including the violent ones during the Q&A. But now I want to hand it back to Colin.
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm just going to close because I agree with Mike. I think the Q&A will be where we really get to explore some of these ideas and get into discussing the matter. But, I've been thinking a lot about this concept of Antifa as the new boogeyman. What do I mean by that? Several times, President Trump threatened to designate Antifa as a terrorist group. That's not possible for a number of reasons. Chief among them is that we don't have a domestic terrorism statute in the United States. Moreover, if we were going to begin designating groups as terrorist organizations, we should let the data drive those decisions, like we do for FTOs, the State Department's designation for foreign terrorist organizations. And if we did, one might surmise that there are a number of groups that would be higher priorities than Antifa, to the extent, and because Michael even talked about this, that Antifa is even a group, which it's not. So that's another complicating factor. But if you think about the KKK, seems like a worthwhile candidate for designation if we did have a domestic terrorism statute, or groups that have actually, committed acts of violence, neo-Nazi groups like Adam Waffen or the Base that have U.S. members and that were created in the United States. We've also seen, I track a group called the Rise Above Movement quite closely, and that's led by an individual named Robert Rundo, who's been trying to organize the far right in Europe. He was recently kicked out of Serbia. He's linked with a number of Russian and Ukrainian far right activists. He's now become obsessed with Antifa, and I've kind of asked myself, well, why is he now focusing on the threat of Antifa in his propaganda? He does a thing called Tea with Rob Rundo, where he sits and he kind of talks and pontificates, and he's why does he talk about Antifa so much now? Well, if the talking point sells, if it resonates, it works, even if the underlying premise is distorted. We've also seen a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and distortions of truth that have run rampant on social media, particularly in the days and weeks after the insurrection at the Capitol. The Washington Times claimed that facial recognition showed evidence that the mob was made up of members of Antifa. The article has since been corrected, but not before it was shared by a congressman, Representative Matt Gaetz, who used the article as proof that the mob was, in fact, members of the violent terrorist group Antifa. Quote, how common is this disinformation? There's a media insights company called Signal Labs. It compiled a list of the most popular false and misleading narratives on social media about the insurrection and counted their media mentions on cable television and social media, in print and online news outlets in the days immediately following the insurrection. The number one distorted truth or myth was that rioters on the Capitol were actually Antifa. It had 411,099 mentions, just in the matter of a couple of days between that kind of broader media ecosystem. And frankly, anytime I give a talk on domestic terrorism in the United States, almost without fail, the first question I'm met with is, what about Antifa? Even if the entire talk was about, violence from the far right, again, because we're looking at data. So I think that's probably a good place to end. And if you're okay with it, Nicole, maybe we'll open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, thank you, Dr. Clarke, and thank you, Dr. Kenney. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the team session. So feel free to keep submitting your questions through the live event Q&A chat. All right, so our most liked question currently in the Q&A chat is, to what extent is Antifa influenced or exploited by Russia and China in social media?
Do you have any thoughts, Mike, or do you want me to? So I haven't looked at data.
The question is whether Antifa is influenced by Russian and Chinese social media. What?
It's, to what extent is Antifa influenced or exploited by Russia and China in social media?
Okay.
So Mike, this is Todd. I think the question is directed at the mis and disinformation that comes out of the Chinese and probably more prominently the Russian sort of machinery that is designed to kind of divide this country and put strain on our democracy.
I could talk a little bit about that. We know just from studying, right, Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns that they look for issues that are highly divisive to Americans. At the top of that list is going to be race every time. And so a lot of the Antifa, especially when it's kind of lumped in with Black Lives Matter, tops that list. So I haven't done a comprehensive study on Russian and Chinese disinformation related to Antifa. However, we did just conclude a study on QAnon, where we actually worked with a firm called Limbic, and the amount of Russian and Chinese disinformation pushing QAnon narratives was tremendous, actually. And we'll release the paper next week through the Soufan Center, but I'll give you a sneak peek of the findings. And interestingly, China has actually moved ahead of Russia in terms of frequency and magnitude with which they promote QAnon narratives. And again, why? Because it works. They go back to the playbook time and time again. There's a great paper from the RAND Corporation by Chris Paul and Miriam Matthews called "The Russian Fire Hose of Falsehood." It's now several years old, but it's a really great laydown of the way that Russia thinks about its disinformation campaign. I briefed it at UCOM maybe several years ago, and it really stands the test of time. So if there is an issue that's divisive, and I would submit that the Antifa issue is among the most divisive, right, because it plays on left versus right, the Russians and the Chinese will be happily promoting that. We also noticed that the Iranians and the Saudis have gotten into the game more than they have in the past. Still low numbers compared to the Russians and the Chinese. But look, this is an asymmetric tactic that costs them little. It offers them a great return on investment. And they consider themselves immune from retribution because, especially China, they control their information environment in a way that we don't.
All right, thank you, Dr. Clarke. All right, so someone else is asking in here where you retrieved your data from when you provided the statistics, Dr. Clarke. I believe that you said it was a report by CSIS, but do you happen to know what that article was called? I can find the link real quick and paste it in the Q&A.
The lead author was Seth Jones, formerly of the RAND Corporation. And it's very transparent. It's got a laydown of the methodology used. I don't know the name of it, but I could chase that down. If you Google CSIS Seth Jones domestic terrorism, you could probably find it quickly. I think it maybe was from October 2020.
Yeah, it's called "The War Comes Home: The Evolution of Domestic Terrorism in the United States."
All right, thank you both. I will go ahead and once you're asking the next question, I'll retrieve the link from online. All right, our next question is, could you speak to the connections between the current iteration of Antifa and the legacy of past movements that mobilized under the same name or similar names, like the late Weimar Germany Antifa and the interwar period, groups during the Cold War, etc.?
Right. Yes, so the history of anti-fascism is about 100 years old. It goes back to the 1930s, even the 1920s in interwar Europe. As you see today, back then it was a counter mobilization movement. With the rise of fascist political parties in Germany, Italy, Britain, in each of those countries, leftist activists counter-mobilized against that phenomenon. And they, the militant participants were willing to fight the Nazis on the streets. And so that is, kind of in a nutshell, the history, but it's also the inspiration. It's important to understand that history because contemporary anti-fascists often refer to it and they use it to justify their argument that we have to physically confront fascists on the streets, whether it's in, the 1920s Weimar German Republic or 2017 following the election of President Trump. Right? They, from their perspective, fascism has to be confronted physically. And they point to the history as an example where peaceful confrontation did not work. And they argue that leftists who organized against the original fascists in those countries and tried to engage in peaceful protests, peaceful pamphleting, that it didn't work. It didn't stop the rise of fascism. And that's why they argue this is why physical confrontation is necessary, because from their perspective, if we're not willing to fight them in the streets, we're not going to keep them from taking power.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kenney. All right, our next question is, why are the two incidents that Dr. Clarke referred to as what constitutes high visibility left-wing Antifa violence? I'm trying to understand the question. Why are the two incidents that Dr. Clarke referred to as what constitutes high visibility left-wing Antifa violence when the protests were much more visible and to a greater extent violent? And protests is in quotes.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but we're talking about terrorism, right? So we're not talking about like breaking windows. We're not even talking about punching people in the face, physically assaulting them, or any of the other. So if the question's about committing actual acts of terrorism, that's why I highlighted those two incidents. I think there's often there's a lot of confusion around what we saw in Portland, Seattle, Oakland, et cetera, where we had, protest rallies and demonstrations that turned violent. Fistfights isn't terrorism, right? Murdering people at a synagogue is terrorism. Murdering people at a Walmart is terrorism. When violence is politically motivated, and results in people being maimed or killed, it can reach the level of terrorism. So I think we have to differentiate between street fights and brawls, and actions that constitute that higher level. Terrorism is a specific thing, but Mike probably has some more thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you, Colin. No, I agree with everything Colin said. The two examples that he gave, one of which we cited in our War on the Rocks piece, what we were trying to do there is to distinguish between different forms of political violence, right? And a riot is not necessarily the same thing as terrorism. That's what Colin is speaking to, right? So a lot of the violence that is, I think, fairly associated with militant anti-fascists in the United States, and it has been increasing in recent years, is essentially rioting, street fights, as well as property damage. So they'll go out and they'll target corporate interests like let's smash the windows of the original Starbucks in Seattle. Or if the event features a confrontation with the Proud Boys, they'll get up in the Black Bloc, which is different than anti-fascism. I can speak more to that later. The Black Bloc is a protest tactic that emerged again out of Europe in the 1980s. The anarchists did it first, and then the anti-fascists started doing it here in the US. They'll get dressed up in the Black Bloc to help protect them. And yeah, they'll go out on the streets and they'll look for white supremacists, people they identify as white supremacists, to physically confront. Typically, it starts with verbal confrontation, shouting back and forth, and it can quickly escalate from there. It can be fistfights, it can be hand weapons, clubs, poles, like flag poles or protest sticks, and it can even involve knives and in some cases guns. That is, face-to-face physical confrontation between militant anti-fascists and people like the Proud Boys, right? So it's not one actor operating in a vacuum. It's a fight, right? And it quickly can escalate to riots, right? And then the other thing that we've seen a lot of is where the militant anti-fascists will attack government targets. They'll attack police stations, they'll attack courthouses. In Seattle, they tried to establish CHAZ, that Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. They established it. Portland is obviously a real hotbed of anti-fascist activity. But the thing about Portland, or I should say larger Oregon, is that there's also a very well-established white supremacist presence, and that's it. Look, the anti-fascists and the far right, they exist in a symbiotic relationship, right? It's not one or the other. Colin touched on this earlier. They respond to each other, right? It's kind of a reciprocal radicalization and a reciprocal violence. I'll stop there.
All right. Well, thank you both. We actually had one of our members of the SMA community, Dana Ayer, bring up the Black Bloc that you referenced, Dr. Kenney. He had said, do we have a sense of overall growth in the network? Is it related to the Black Bloc or other tactical efforts or ideas? And is it a post-2016 movement?
Okay, so the Black Bloc, that goes back to the 1980s. Okay, it was the anarchists in Western Europe that essentially invented the Black Bloc, and they found it to be a very effective protest tactic, especially for violent protests that sometimes escalated to riots. And it's effective for a couple of reasons. When everybody's dressed in black, it becomes a lot harder for the police or security agencies to identify specific individuals and gather evidence against them for prosecution, right? So it worked in that sense. And so anarchists in the US picked up on the tactic. And so it was really the Battle of Seattle in 1999, where you had anarchist protesters in Seattle protesting, the World Trade Organization conference, and got in. I'm sure many of our listeners remember, right? The big street fights, right? That kind of pioneered and made the Black Bloc tactic famous in the United States. About 2 years later, in 2002, a self-identified anti-fascist group used this tactic specifically in a specifically anti-fascist counter demonstration against people they identified as white supremacists. And that's called the Battle of York. The Battle of York is believed to be the first time American anti-fascists used the Black Bloc tactic, which by that point had been around for 15 years. Since then, the Black Bloc has been picked up by other anti-fascist groups. But we can't equate the Black Bloc with anti-fascism, right? Because they're not the same thing. The Black Bloc is essentially a tactic, right? It's a form of action to protect the protesters, like I was mentioning earlier, right? But anti-fascism, that is, it's obviously different, right? I just want to make sure we're clear on that.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kenney, for elaborating on the Black Bloc. I want to bring our attention now to a question from SMA's director, Mr. Todd Beasy. He asks, does Antifa direct any of their activism towards the U.S. government and its policies, or do they focus principally on groups and individuals that they deem as fascists?
No, this is a good question. I'm happy. Thank you for the question, because one thing that I didn't mention is you can say, well, okay, if anti-fascists are just worried about the far right and just worried about Trump, then we should problem solved, right, with the election of Joe Biden. But in fact, anti-fascists and anarchists throughout the country welcomed Joe Biden into office on J20 with doing the same thing they did during President Trump's inauguration, which was to organize protests in different cities around the country. And some of those protests did turn violent, especially in Seattle and Portland. They do not like Biden, right? Remember, and I guess I haven't made this clear earlier, so let me state it now. These are far left extremists. These are not mainstream folks, okay? They're anarchists, most of them. They want to overthrow our current system of government. There's no doubt about it. They want to replace it with more direct forms of democracy and mutual aid, okay? They are not Biden fans. They hate the Biden administration's policy on things like globalization, criminal justice, and immigration. For them, the Biden administration doesn't go nearly far enough. Neither does any other Democrat, right? Antifa was never the Democratic Party's security unit, right? They hate the Democrats. I mean, people in my sample, I asked them, one person in particular, I reached out to him around the time of election. He knew what was at stake in that election for him, but still, he had no interest in voting. They reject our current political system. They don't vote, and they certainly don't vote for the Democratic Party.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kenney, and thank you, Todd, for the question. All right, so this next question is from Matthew from DENS, and he asks, when Antifa is referenced or discussed, it's often taken at face value that they are against fascism and racism, yet they're seemingly willing to utilize violence, harassment, and threat of violence to silence the speech of those whose politics they disagree with, and they often use racist tropes against minorities that don't align with their worldviews. Should we accept that these people are anti-fascist because they identify that way, or can we see this possibly as being fascism with better branding?
Yeah, no, I understand the point. So the core of it, I think, is the issue of violence, right? A militant anti-fascist is perfectly willing to use violence to counter folks that they define as the fascists, right? They don't care about free speech, right? Their argument on free speech is free speech didn't work in the Weimar Republic in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, right? Free speech does not stop fascists from taking power. That's their argument, okay? So they're not interested in protecting free speech when it comes to white supremacists and neo-Nazis, because from their view, the white supremacists and neo-Nazis are fundamentally violent, right? Their whole ideology and goal is to create a white ethno-state through violence, right? So from the anti-fascist perspective, the way they look at it, the only way to stop that is through violence. So they actually scoff at liberals like me who would be like, well, what about free speech? They would say it's immaterial to them. We have to confront violence with violence. That is their view. Now, if you want to call anybody who engages in violence a fascist, okay, that's your right to do that. I personally would not do that. I feel like at that point we're stretching the concept of fascism so broadly. Anybody who uses violence is a fascist. That the concept essentially becomes meaningless at that point. But I would also agree that militant anti-fascists also apply the fascist label quite loosely, and they don't consider other essential attributes of fascism when they label people on the far right to be fascists.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kenney. I have a question for Dr. Clarke. I believe that you already addressed the first part of this question. Someone was clarifying that you had mentioned 2 actions that resulted in fatalities, but they were asking about the 100 days of rioting and violence in Portland. But the clarifying question that I did want to bring up is this person asks if those 100 days of rioting and violence in Portland was counted as 100 separate events or counted as one. But it seems like you made the distinction that you were talking about acts of terrorism as opposed to the protests in Portland.
Yeah, I mean, look, just like we don't count, like, were it not for the death of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville, what we saw in Charlottesville in 2017 wouldn't have been counted as terrorism, right? Because it was a protest, a demonstration. It happened to be on the far right. So that's one, I think, another when we talk about myths, that there's an ulterior motive to researchers. I mean, it's often suggested that we're operating in bad faith. I mean, I've been maligned as, a left-wing activist because I, again, look at data. I'm more than willing to concede that if Antifa becomes far more violent and commits acts of terrorism, that's what I'm going to say is happening. I'm going to look at the data. If the violence from the far right begins to ebb, that's what I'm going to say. I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm out here calling balls and strikes. I'm actually a registered independent. I'm not loyal to either party. So it's not that we're counting violent demonstrations and protests on the right as acts of terrorism and not counting those same things on the left. We're strictly coding acts of terrorism where they occur. And again, breaking the windows of a Starbucks or smashing the windows of a store and looting it, it's not terrorism because, we have a bar, right, that we need to consider. There's a threshold for what we consider an act of terrorism. And that applies across the board. I'm agnostic to the ideology that motivates it. Yeah, sure, I want to understand it, but I don't care if it's from the left or the right. I've devoted my career to national security, primarily focused on jihadis, looking at what's happening overseas. Now I'm looking at what's happening in the United States. And again, this is empirical evidence. This isn't Colin Clarke's opinion. This is looking at data. Now, if you want to get into the Excel sheet and start, quibbling over, well, did this count? Did that count? We may, disagree on a couple of data points, but the data is so overwhelming in one direction that even if we, changed a couple of the points from left to the right, it's not going to alter the trend, which is that we've continued to see a rise in violence from the far right.
Yeah, it's really hard to, if I could just do a quick follow-up, it is difficult to code specific incidents as one form of violence or another. The data that Colin has been using comes from a very highly regarded, I should say, centrist think tank, the Center for Security and International Studies. And that's how they coded it. you can take issue with that, right? But the definitional threshold that Colin mentioned that I just wanted to touch on real quick is, does this act of there's two things you have to keep in mind. First, the violence, right? The target, you have to have an immediate target, right? But also there's the wider audience, right? The violence has to be of such a magnitude that it causes fear or dread in that wider audience. That's the psychological coercion that is absolutely essential to terrorism, right? Without terror, there can be no terrorism. And a riot is not the same thing, right? A riot doesn't necessarily inspire fear across the country. You know, maybe it does. I mean, maybe some people here would want to take issue with that, you know, and that's where some of these gray areas are. Punching a Nazi in the face, right? Yeah. So Richard Spencer, okay, that he was the direct victim of that, a violent political act against him. But was that act meant to cause fear and terror in a wider audience? That to me is more terrorism. And terrorism studies, that wider audience is, in practical terms, that usually means government or society.
All right, thank you both. I want to direct our attention now to this question about demographics. So someone's asking if, this person's saying that the general perception of Antifa is that these are mostly Caucasian, college-educated 20-somethings who come from a well-to-do backgrounds. Is this a fair statement?
I would agree with the race part, right? They're mostly white. The ages, yeah, about mid 20s to early 30s, mid 20s to early, mid 30s is about the modal age range. In terms of class, I would say there's more variety there. A lot of them come out of working class backgrounds. A lot of them do not have college degrees. I mean, people in my sample, high school, they completed high school. Some of them were high school dropouts. There's a lot of working class anti-fascists. So it's definitely not, you know, upper middle class, although some upper middle class anti-fascists, you know, engage in militant anti-fascism. But with respect to the demographics, yeah, it is primarily white. I agree with that. It's a very white phenomenon. That's true.
All right, thank you for that clarification. I'll bring our attention now to a question from one of our colleagues in the UK, Professor Richard Allington from BSTL. And he asks, the premise of the Antifa label and what's seen in the open literature is based on what the organization isn't, i.e. not fascist. What's harder to find is what the current organization deliberately stands for example, as a collection of principles. How do you think that Antifa could or should develop from what could be called a protest movement to an organization which could possibly or positively engage in societal or political change?
Well, that's where the difference between anti-fascism and anarchism becomes important, right? Because anti-fascism, by definition, they are a counter mobilization phenomenon. They exist to counter, again, what they identify as the fascists. And the principles that they subscribe to speak to that. Now, anarchists are different, right? Anarchists are not just counter something, they're also pro something. And what they're pro for is essentially replacing the current political and economic system with something that looks very different, something that is based on a democratic form of government that is based very much locally based, where you would have local communities that are making all the important political, social, economic decisions through local decision making based on consensus. The other main principle of anarchism is this idea of mutual aid, right? Because the problem with the local politics argument is, how does that scale up? The anarchists would say, well, it scales up through mutual aid. So when you have a disaster where the resources of a local community are not enough, then you're going to engage in mutual aid, and other local communities will band together to help each other out, to provide the resources that are needed to deal with that situation. But again, decision making would be very much done through what they call a democratic consensus-based decision model.
All right, thank you, Dr. Kenney. So we're getting close to the end of our session. However, both of our speakers have agreed to take a few questions over time. So we will be continuing with the Q&A past the hour. This next question is, the representation of Antifa in the media is highly variable and often contradictory. Peaceful defenders versus violent actors, ideology versus organized groups, etc. How do you feel that the polarization is driven by the political or ideological position of individual media outlets versus the lack of homogeneity within Antifa itself?
I'll speak a little to this because, I heard someone use the phrase recently describing mainstream media outlets as rage profiteers. And it actually really resonated with me because I think, that tends to be what the media, and again, the media, right, as if it were a monolith, which we know it's not. What sells? Getting people fired up, getting people angry. We just had the most contentious election in our country's history, arguably. I mean, certainly within my lifetime. I think, this feels like the most polarized, partisan times that I've ever lived through. I mean, you can feel it in regular discussions with neighbors, with family, with friends. And I think, I think partisan news, not only network television, but social media, has a lot to do with that and drives that. And so if you are tuning into, right-wing media, you are going to get one picture. And if you're tuning into left-wing media, you're going to get another picture. How do you find truth these days? How do you vet your sources, your information? I do this for a living. So people say they don't have the time. This is my job, to read and do research. But most people don't have that time, and so you can't blame them for being, I don't say ill-informed, but not optimally informed. But what I think we can do in this country is focus on digital literacy. How do we figure out what's real and what's not? Or how do we understand that what we're looking at might be biased or influenced by a certain ideology? But again, a lot of people look at, they seek out these echo chambers because they want to hear what they already believe in. This is confirming their beliefs. So I don't have, a lot of solutions. It's very frustrating for me because I think a lot of the discussions I get into when I talk about data is being influenced by large conglomerates of media that are pushing a certain viewpoint. I mean, just think about some of those data points that I talked about before. Rioters on the Capitol were actually Antifa, which we know is not true. Just look at the data is very clear. Who was involved there. It was the Oath Keepers, it was the 3%ers, and it was a range of other Trump supporters. QAnon had a pretty wide representation. 411,099 mentions in 2 days that Antifa was at the Capitol and that this was a false flag event, right? More conspiracy. This was, again, picked up by the Washington Times and promoted by a member of Congress. So, I don't blame people for being confused. They're being deliberately misled. How do you, reel that in? I don't know. But again, this is a field day for our adversaries. The Russians, the Chinese, and others are licking their chops when they see us turning on each other. and they're just sitting there turning the screw. And it costs them next to nothing, right? And while we're distracted, while we're figuring out our own house, they have more leverage and leeway to act as they wish in the world. We should be talking about what's happening to the Uyghurs right now. But no, we're talking about, whether it was Antifa during the Capitol insurrection. That plays right into the Chinese Communist Party's, plays right into their playbook. So, I don't know. I'm very frustrated with the kind of media ecosystem, and smarter people than me hopefully have some tangible solutions going forward.
All right, thank you, Dr. Clarke. In a similar light, someone stated that organizations like GEDEL, START, GTD, et cetera, often comb through open source data to understand the size, activity, and involvement of domestic terrorist organizations. And this question also gets to a leftward leaning in global journalism. And this person asks, to what extent does that general, albeit unintentional, left lean in global journalism influence reporting on Antifa? And how does that affect your analysis?
Do you want to take that, Colin, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go, Mike, and then I'll add something at the end.
Okay. As I understand the question, it's about whether bias in the media might, unintentionally influence our own research. I think that's kind of the core of it. Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. It's a fair question, right? The fact of the matter is, and tonight's the night that I teach qualitative methods to my PhD students here at Gispia. So all research has forms of bias in it, right? Whether it's quantitative, qualitative, experimental, right? Also, if you're talking about social science research, there's going to be some bias in it. The point is to try and recognize those sources of bias and correct for it when we design our studies, when we gather the data, when we analyze the data, and then ultimately when we report them, right? So in the case of just speaking for myself, my own research, certain media outlets have a certain take on something like Antifa, right? So if I was designing a study on media reports about anti-fascism, I would have to be very careful about my sample of media organizations that I used. If I just use Breitbart or Fox News, I'm going to get a certain slant, right? And if I'm not aware of that, my findings are going to be biased, right? So in any sample you draw, kind of a core rule of thumb, a core principle is always build diversity into your sample, regardless of the data source, whether it's media reports or, in my case, respondents, right? You never build a sample. If you're doing qualitative interviews the way I do, you never build a sample around one seed or one key respondent because of this issue, because people sometimes have a tendency to refer us to people that think like them. It builds homogenization bias into the sample. So the researcher has to be aware of this and build diversity. So rather than using one seed, use multiple seeds. So anytime I do a qualitative research project on anti-fascism or something else, I'm very aware of this and the need to build diversity into our sampling, because otherwise you're going to end up with a problem like I think the questioner was getting at.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. I would add a couple of things. One, to the extent that it's possible, researchers are always going to seek out primary source documents, right? We're not going to rely on the New York Times if there's a, let's say, U.S. government charging document, right, from DOJ. That's going to be, I write occasionally for the CTC Sentinel at West Point, right? we're always looking for primary source documents or government documents, right? Which tend to, in my opinion, be unbiased, right? They're basically stating the facts of what happened. They're not saying, this is left wing, right wing, but you can, based on the target, right? You have a sense of if someone shoots up a synagogue, well, you have a pretty good idea of which category to put them in. The other thing I'll say is that I want to give people an understanding. Again, I can only speak for myself here. I spent 10 years at the RAND Corporation. When we do any kind of project that involves coding or data analysis, the level of scrutiny that goes into coding something, this isn't just like willy-nilly, like, yeah, well, let's put it in that category. We have a team of analysts that analyze the data independently, then meet together and painstakingly go through each and every data point where people raise issues and have debates. This isn't one, research assistant plopping stuff in an Excel sheet and then turning it into a chart. These are, especially for reports, the CSIS reports, a great example of that. For anyone that knows Seth Jones, he's a person of, the highest integrity. But it's not just Seth and his team. That then goes for peer review. So I think for that particular paper, Bruce Hoffman, myself, Jacob Ware, and several other analysts had access not only to the report, but to the underlying data. And I'll give you an example. The Kyle Rittenhouse incident, that was not coded as a terrorist attack. The amount of debate and round robin that we had just on that one data point, and emails and phone calls, where people were making their case of why it was or why it was not a terrorist attack. I mean, that one incident, right, out of many, we spent hours scrutinizing, and the authors decided that no, it was not a right-wing terrorist attack. It actually appears in the footnote, and there's an explanation why. So again, I think the level of concern here, and if you think that people are operating in bad faith, that's a different conversation to have. But as at RAND, we were nonpartisan, right? That's what we staked our reputation on. CSIS is much the same. I have no agenda other than to describe terrorism the way I've been describing it. It's funny because I was never accused of bias when I was talking about ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Everyone kind of took my word and said, oh, you're a really thorough researcher. But now we're in a different environment because we're talking about domestic terrorism, and people feel like if you're criticizing the far right, you're implying there's something wrong with someone on the political right. And that's not the same. I don't think that Republicans own white supremacy, right? No one should claim to. I'm not insulting someone on the right if I'm, talking about white supremacy. Just as if someone's bashing Antifa, it shouldn't offend Democrats. Again, as Michael said, they don't, Democrats don't own Antifa, and they don't support Joe Biden. So we're talking about extremists here. We're talking about violent extremists. We're not talking about, people that are politicians or Americans that belong to a political party.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Clarke and Dr. Kenney. All right. Speaking of okay, well, let's go on to this question from David. And the question is, similar to the radical Islam effort of the past 30 plus years, we seem to be focused on finding the elusive head of the proverbial snake so that we can take them out. And then the problem will be over, all the while ignoring the root ideology. It seems like we focus time, money, and resources on Antifa, BLM, QAnon, etc., and then we're surprised at the relatively small numbers of the official members. This seems to complicate the obvious and trivialize the momentous. Shouldn't we focus the root on ideology sources, and shouldn't we focus on the root of ideology sources and where those ideologies are propagated? Like the question disappeared. The Frankfurt School critical theory ideas that may manifest in roots of which Antifa, BLM, etc. may only be a visible part.
Do you want me to take first crack, Colin? Or
yeah, I'm struggling to see what the question was in there. Maybe.
Okay, I'll start and then you can jump in. No, So, should we be focusing more on the ideologies? I think it's a fair and interesting question. The problem is, in democratic countries like the United States, it's not illegal to hold radical political and or economic beliefs, right? Personally, I think that's a good thing. I don't want us as a country to lose that. So that's why in terrorism studies, scholars often, for them, kind of the line in the sand is violence, right? Does the ideology escalate to violent political action? And if so, to what we've been talking about today, is that violent political action terrorism, or is it some other form of political violence? So if I do agree that anti-fascism, especially anarchism, there's an ideology there. Okay, there's a set of political beliefs that are somewhat coherent, that people subscribe to, and they're pretty extreme beliefs. I mean, they're radical in the sense that if those beliefs were enacted, it would cause a revolutionary change in our country. Personally, I don't want to go down that path, right? But again, I'm glad I live in a country where just having radical beliefs in and of itself is not illegal. What's illegal is when you act on those beliefs to engage in criminal action involving violence or other forms of criminal activity. So I hesitate to say that, we have to go after the ideology, but I do concede it's tough, because the ideology is being spread, right? I mean, that's what we're seeing during the pandemic. As Colin has spoken about previously, we're in other presentations that I've seen him in, we're all stuck at home with our computers, and people are going on to really interesting websites and they're absorbing these ideas. It is a problem.
I would add, just kind of to go back to my earlier point, I just want to emphasize how closely analysts and researchers scrutinize these attacks, and why does it matter? So I'll give you one example. When we were looking at coding a database, there was an incident where a known neo-Nazi murdered his female acquaintance. And someone said, oh, there you go, neo-Nazi committed murder, act of terrorism. Wait a minute, why did he commit the act of murder? Once you actually did the research, he murdered this woman because she was going around telling people that he had HIV, which he did, that he contracted in jail. So if a neo-Nazi murders someone, is that an act of terrorism? No, he didn't kill this woman, because of his ideology. He killed her for something totally different. But unless you were to kind of dig and do the research there, someone might have said, oh, neo-Nazi killed someone, boom, that's a right-wing terrorist attack. But it's actually not. And I will say, one of the things I'm concerned about moving forward, I'm concerned about, and this links back to the media, which is, maybe this is a bad pun given the subject matter, but jumping the gun. And what I mean by that is, when things go back to normal, or close to normal in this country, where we're relaxing COVID measures, people begin congregating again, life picks up to somewhere resembling normal, we're a country, and this is just a fact, that experiences high levels of gun violence, right? So one of the concerns I have is that we have an incident and there's a workplace shooting, right? And someone in the media finds the name of this person, they do a scrub of their social media and see that this person was a big Trump supporter. And it starts spreading on Twitter that this was a right-wing terrorist attack. Just because it could have been an act of workplace violence or something else, that this individual, we looked at his social media and he's a MAGA guy. So that's where I think, there's a real problem in conflation, and people kind of, again, I haven't seen this happen, but I am concerned, about the possibility, and I'm on, being very cognizant and aware of that. So I'll end there.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Clarke and Dr. Kenney. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today's speaker session, but I'd like to thank both of our speakers today for taking the time to speak with us. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in for this speaker session. We did have one person ask for a source or a link for them to watch for the forthcoming study on China and Russia promoting QAnon conspiracy narratives. So I don't know if you had mentioned that article, or I can hunt this down for this person, but feel free to shoot me an email, whoever asked this question, and I'll direct you to the right place. But anyways, thank you everyone for tuning in, and have a great day.
Thank you.